Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. What has happened in the development industry and city planning after COVID-19, I think, is an issue that lots of people are giving a lot of thought to. And we've had the privilege of having numerous different people, Jennifer Keesmack, Ken Greenberg, Joe Barrage, et cetera, on our show to talk about that. And one of the most renowned architects, planners in Mississauga that I know of is Michael Spaziani, who is the owner of, what's it called? MSAI, Michael Spaziani Architects, Inc. Michael is someone that I know of because he was very involved in the Mississauga Summit, the Mississauga Arts Council, and almost every other organization that's positive of the community going on. He was one of the key people behind the Lakeview effort as well. And one of the things that I love about Michael is he's the lead guitarist in a rock and roll band. And so that makes him even more interesting than he would be to start with. Michael Spaziani, welcome to our show. How are you today, sir?
I'm very well. Thank you, Brian, for having me. That's quite a cast you've already spoken with. I feel honored to be a part of this.
Well, you are one of the people I respect more than anyone else in the development industry. I think that you've done some incredibly interesting urban environment plannings. You've shown me, I think, in the past, some things in Barrie, and certainly you've been very involved in Port Credit that were, retail entertainment that are akin to Granville Island or South Street Seaport or things like that. What's going to happen, do you think, to sort of downtown, or not even downtown, but urban centers, even in suburbs, retail and retail entertainment facilities? Is there an opportunity for that in the future, or are they going to die out?
Well, it's a tough one. I'm engaged in a number of sites in Toronto and Vaughan now and Markham that are focal points for transit stations. And the transit stations bring expectation of both a complete community. So in other words, places to work, places to play, all of that. And what's happening is official plans in all those cases, and a lot of it has to do with the young subway expansion or extension north. So what you're seeing is, policies are in place to provide office at these nodes because of the transit component and densities and appropriate densities. But the commercial component and the retail component, those are the tough ones, especially as they relate to COVID now. The entire office demand in mixed use has always been a little bit difficult as a component of a residential development. But now there's policies that instruct an expectation for significant office in places where there's transit. And more than ever, we've had trouble imagining that they would be filled to the extent that planning had suggested. So all of these ideas of complete community are beginning to get molded in a slightly different way, with the idea that people may not get back to the workplace as soon as we had hoped. There may be, maybe another year, maybe it'll come back completely to normal. And these developments are still struggling to find ways to get approval with these components. And the components include things like affordable housing as well. An important initiative that's sort of come through the planning channels. But given the cost of housing, the cost of development, the irony is that to provide a 3-bedroom house apartment at an affordability level that makes sense is, again, a very difficult challenge. So we have difficulties on expanding this idea of complete community for people to be able to get into them, for office components to get built out, and for viable retail, which has now taken on a whole other kind of characteristic.
So it's a big change that COVID-19 is potentially going to cause the development industry. Is that not correct?
It's a huge change, and it's hard to make decisions that respect policies that could be 5 to 10 years old through an official plan and council approvals. And now we're looking for hard commitments to move ahead with these developments. And there's uncertainty to commit because so much is in flux. Another component of this Well, is not even the use of transit. I mean, COVID, transit use has dropped off, and
Down
it's
like
created this
70,
whole other
80%
focus
in
on
revenue.
the revenue's down, and then you look at the impact on the automobile use. So all of a sudden, the streets aren't as packed. So the issue of driving has kind of gone away, and that affects parking supply, which is a whole other evolution of this. We used to be able to count on sites having almost no parking by virtue of being on a transit stop or a transit line. So now people are choosing to drive when they have to drive, albeit they may be driving less now. But it's kind of thrown a wrench into all of this idea about reduced reliance on the car. And we're getting a little bit more of getting back to using the car, albeit in a shutdown mode right now. But I don't know, it just sends the whole transit trend a little bit into reverse. And so this is, there's been two trends as well. Another trend where there's been a big impact is seniors housing, which is a whole area that my firm has been specializing in for the last 30 years, actually. We got into it early, but lately we've been quite involved in that. So the approach to seniors housing has really gone through a radical change where, previously a larger retirement home or a long-term care facility, you'd be trying to maximize units, you try to get efficiency in staffing. All of those things have now come into question, where the idea of smaller is better, containment is better. So again, that's radically shifted the idea about how do you house people in a potentially exposed environment due to COVID. So we're also seeing a trend to keep people in their homes longer. So this is an entire industry that's growing up now to prevent seniors or to keep seniors in their family home or in their familiar home and not go into the institutional level. This is
Sounds like
something
a pretty
again,
challenging time for people like yourself. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Michael Spaziani in just a minute and go through each one of these different issues in sequence, if that's all right. Stay with us.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting about what's happened in the development business, particularly as regards, what we're going to build, how we're going to design it, what the planning process is, et cetera, in a post-COVID-19 era. Michael, maybe we're joined tonight by Michael Spaziani, an architect that I have worked with on a couple of different things in Mississauga, and a really quite impressive gentleman. Michael, maybe we could just back up. How long have you been in the architecture planning business?
Well, let's say I graduated 1975, so that puts me a few decades back. So, we celebrated a 50th anniversary of our classmates recently, so that tells
Excellent.
you.
And have you always been focused in, your office is here in Mississauga. Have you always sort of been based out of Mississauga?
I came to Mississauga about 30 years ago, actually, so for a long time now. But I did start my career in Toronto and Ottawa, which a lot of architects do. They go to the big centers. I started as an urban designer in Ottawa back in 1977, 78, and then moved to Toronto and set up my practice or apprenticed in downtown Toronto. So that was where I started. And my work has always involved sort of larger city planning initiatives or master planning on larger sites. So it's been always a focus of mine. And I started my career, I was traveling to Africa doing large campuses for education campuses for the World Bank and for the development banks, both in South America, the Caribbean, and in Africa. And that kind of gave me this appreciation of community development. How do you do large communities, some cases from scratch? And that's what attracted me to Mississauga, barely over 40 years old, essentially a new city that's emerged. And I found that to be quite an interesting place to find myself now, and for the last 30 years in my career, how to get engaged and the future of that city, the history of that city, the different trends that affected it, from sprawling kind of ideas, the single family house, automobile dependency, to a city that's now emerging as a city with a downtown and with various village settings like Port Credit, which I chose coming out of an urban environment in Toronto. I chose Port Credit very specifically because of its walkability, its proximity to waterfront, which Toronto never really could quite get together until recently. They're starting to get it now. And the fact that it had a kind of, let's call it a historic focal point for retail. It had a kind of core of retail and an ability and a kind of a density around the core that was related to the GO train when it came in the 60s. So in a way, it became my model of a community, and I chose to move and live here and work here eventually to enjoy that and to see what I could contribute to it, because it suited my stage of life and my lifestyle. And we drag the kids out, put them in schools out here. They're all graduates of local schools, and so I've embraced this place as a real focus of my interests.
When you think about the history of urban planning, you're the expert, not I, but when I think about it, sort of pre-World War II, a lot of places people would want to live in, whether it be Port Credit or the beaches or Blurius Village, were sort of similar to what you've just described for Port Credit, pre-war kind of communities that were organic in their development. And then post-World War II, with building of highways and zoning regulations and cars, et cetera, we had suburban sprawl. And that suburban sprawl occurred for the next chunk of time. And then in the last, 10 or 20 years, we've had sort of this re-urbanization as people have moved back downtown, and we've had, density and some of the things that you talked about in regards to, mixed use communities, office, retail, condos, et cetera. However, COVID-19 has changed things a little bit. I understand that the condo business, the condo rentals and condo prices are down dramatically in downtown Toronto, where a lot of those condos were very small, were leased to or sold to foreigners that were then trying to lease them out. A lot of them were on Airbnb, et cetera. And that people, didn't want to be in a 500 to 1,000 square foot apartment if they had to live in there 24 hours a day. It was okay if you went to there just to sleep, but when you had to be there all day long, you needed more space. And so therefore, suburban real estate has been booming. Does this mean that we're going to go through another trend where people are going to go back to the suburbs and away from the downtown environments that you've been sort of a proponent of?
Well, I think, it's an interesting topic, because I think the people that have invested in and embraced the let's call it the denser urban environment of, say, downtown Toronto, defend it to the end. They don't admit that there's any change that COVID has brought to them, other than a degree of care on an elevator, things like that. But I know those in our situation, where we do enjoy a kind of the best of both worlds. I look out my backyard and I've got the Credit River, but I can walk down the street and be on a GO train or go to my favorite bar down on Lakeshore. So I've tried to balance this ability to enjoy open space, but also the urban environment. But I don't think, I hear that investor pricing has gone down, but I don't know that, based on our workload lately, we are preparing for urban projects mostly in Toronto at these nodes where transit is intersecting with the development opportunity. And we see no let up there. So I think the view of the development community is that we'll get through this and we'll get past COVID. This will represent a hiccup, and it may affect rental rates in the interim. But I still believe that we'll get through this with a strong urban desire, as well as a less urban desire. And I've always believed that these two polar opposites can be brought together through things like our strategic plan that look at mixed use and focal points in our community to try to get more walkability. That's still going to become a main kind of design underpinning of any new development. Things will be tested for that. So COVID all of a sudden COVID brings an awareness of how wide a sidewalk has to be. And that's something I've been focusing on in my work. Sidewalks have to be a certain dimension just for the quality of the space. That idea of the tight, European sidewalk is kind of going away. And we're demanding in places like Yorkville to make sure that we have a ground condition that allows a spatial and landscape quality that counteracts that idea of the concrete jungle. And that plays well with the idea of the COVID distancing. It plays well with the growth of pets, like pet policies and dog walking policies are becoming huge components of enjoyment of life and companionship. So all of a sudden, pets have become hard to get because of the demand, mostly because of being locked up and through COVID. People are thinking of how to improve their, in a sense, their loneliness or their lack of companionship. So all of a sudden, pets have come into the spotlight in this discussion. And that affects open space, sidewalk widths, all of that stuff as well. So I see all of this kind of, in a way, pointing to a better resolution of our urban spaces. We've fought for every bit of green space and every bit of park we could get on major developments. That's become a really central feature of any master planning we're doing now. Where's the park? How big is it? Does it serve the needs of that walking community? So that's emerged, I think, as even a higher priority focal point, which is a good thing.
Now, can I interrupt and ask you a question on that? Because it seems to me, and again, my sample size is small because I've been isolated in Mississauga for the last couple of months, not traveling nearly as much as lots of people have. But my sense is that we ended up building a lot of parks that were farther away from people and you had to drive to them. And then last spring, when we closed the parking for those parks, the parks became only available to the people that could walk or bike to them and no longer drive. And I'm thinking, in Mississauga about a lot of the lakefront parks and the conservation area parks and things like that. And we really almost took away from the vast majority of a lower income population access to nice parks, I thought. And it was a shame.
It's true. Yeah, I know, because it created a problem. I mean, in Port Credit, we know we have these beautiful lakefront parks, but on any sunny weekend day or holiday weekend, they would be inundated by people driving down from other parts of the city or even from the region. And so that's a symptom of the lack of, let's call it, the distribution of those types of spaces to within local communities, and the quality of our waterfront. Port Credit, Mississauga has this incredible waterfront that's accessible. So it's going to be always, it's a little bit like the beaches. It's always going to have that attraction, that public attraction or wider attraction. But the cure for this is to think of parks in all developments as a local amenity first. So what we're seeing in a place that needs parks, like downtown Toronto, we're seeing an idea that we have to increase the number of the types of parks. So no longer is it this one park with a soccer field that you had to drive to. It's a strip of land that could be as little as 10 feet wide that's added to an edge of a building. And it forms a kind of a linear park. So we're seeing this trend move to more what we call surgical parks, or smaller strips of parks that can be created through a development application on the lands within the developer's purview. That's a big shift, and Toronto's been exercising that. And we're getting this new, let's say, range of park types that can be postage stamp entrances to an existing park, or it can be just a double row of trees in a certain area. And what that provides on a distributed local basis is that you always have immediate proximity to the benefits of an open landscape or a park landscape. Less to do with active parks like soccer fields, as the classic example, or baseball diamonds. Those will always be needed in larger format locations. But to take the heat off of those and these waterfront locations, we need a whole range of park types that can be wide sidewalks, starts with wider sidewalks. It becomes enhanced intersections. It becomes ways of crossing a busy street. These can all be little gems of the public realm. And I'm seeing that as a very positive direction now in tight urban areas where development intensity is expected and development return is expected at a high level. But the character of, and the quality of the open space, albeit in smaller packages, is so much more important. So I see that now even growing in importance with the COVID situation.
Tell me what you think is going to happen to retail. You think about Port Credit or Oakville, Lakeshore Road, et cetera. There are so many stores that have got for lease signs on it or closed. COVID has been just a devastating impact on our small businesses. Are Main Street retails in our sort of urban, suburban environments going to come back?
I think they will. And I've always felt this, that we've had so much retail, so many retail streets available. You think of the entirety of Lakeshore. I've always felt that it's never easy to have a strong component where there would be a, let's call it a high street or a really prominent retail focus when you have such a immense opportunity to have this unending strip of retail shops. So all I'm saying is that we need to have focal points for that retail. If we have focal points, that takes down the demand for filling all of our retail spaces and watering it down with a lot of weaker demand now. I always looked at Danforth East as a tough retail strip where it just was an unending strip of retail parallel to a subway line. But it was almost impossible to fill that with high quality, the kind of retail that we like to point to that we see in European cities, that strong, vital, viable, Main Street kind of effect. So I think the cure for this is to admit that there's only a certain number of retailers that will survive, and they're going to choose to be, in the case of Port Credit, that seems to be between Highway 10 and the river as the focal point of that. So that's already naturally emerging. But so many have struggled with this in the interim with COVID. They've compensated through takeout. So we're going to see more takeout, focus on takeout. People are probably doing that more than ever before. I know we are. So that's a bit of a lifesaver for some of the businesses.
I loved a lot of the patios that we had that the city's allowed outdoors on the sidewalks and even on parking lanes this past summer. Do you think we should change that somehow, and how, and should it be permanent?
Well, I think it should be permanent. I think that was one of the brilliant kind of directions that many municipalities were following, and Jim Tovey, to his credit, had instituted in Port Credit. It still remains to say that even though that was a great first step, we have to look at ways to engage that more. And the problem in Port Credit with that is the presence of Lakeshore as a highway. Doesn't know if it's a highway or a village main street. And there's this constant tension between the two. So when you sit out on those patios on Lakeshore, it's almost impossible to have a conversation because of traffic noise. So our attention has been focusing to how do you improve the amenity and the quality of Lakeshore. As an example, if you can make a street, tame it in terms of size and flow, and this is a big if in Port Credit, because we always hear from the traffic engineers, oh, it's absolutely essential. The QEW has an accident. We need Lakeshore. Yes, but I think there's still ways to affect that role as for transportation. But
downtown Oakville has widened their sidewalks dramatically, gone from 4 lanes to 2 lanes, exactly. And really tamed it and made it a beautiful walking area.
Exactly. And there's the essential difference. There's people that are still defending Lakeshore as a regional highway, and they just can't imagine reducing the 4 lanes, even though I keep saying locally that it functions often as a 2-lane road because there are not as many left turn lanes. Someone makes a left turn in the main part of it, and you've blocked the passage. So, and we've done, every time we see a sewer connection or some closure of the street to do an improvement, we're down to 2 lanes. And I've experienced those delays. They are minor. When you're used to urban living, you realize that that would not be an imposition, at least anecdotally. And I think it's a key to making our cities vibrant and functional and supportive of our retail businesses. We're the landlords, if you will, of these streets. We can make them absolute gems and support our retailers. All you have to do in Lakeshore, and there's been a lot of discussion, is to take it from 4 to 3 lanes with a common turning lane in the middle. And you'd have all of that extra space to dedicate to a variety of other things, including bike lanes, including wider sidewalks. These are, and trees. As fundamental as that, a healthy tree needs space and needs space in the public realm. So those are all benefits that I see could begin to reanimate our retailers when stores reopen, and they will reopen. I think it's a matter of survival in the interim.
We're chatting with Michael Spaziani, architect and urban thinker, about what's going to happen with our developments post-COVID-19. We're going to take a break and come back more with Michael in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking tonight with Michael Spaziani. He runs an architectural firm, an urban planning firm in Port Credit, Mississauga, but he does work across Ontario, across Canada, Michael?
Well, it used to be Canada. We don't do as much across Canada anymore, but we had in the past. I had done work with various firms in Thunder Bay and Lethbridge, Alberta, and Halifax. But lately, our focus has been in the Greater Toronto area, including Hamilton. Hamilton, we've been extremely busy, and there's a city that's enjoying a kind of renaissance of growth, a little bit more affordability, beautiful heritage bones. Hamilton's had that kind of sleeping ability. It's had old industries that were suitable for things like retrofit for artists and communities like that. So Hamilton's been extremely an important focus for us. We've been doing it
because of affordability, is it not?
It starts with affordability, but it also is then augmented by the quality of the urban environment. Some of the heritage districts, you've been to Locke Street lately, you've been to see some of the qualities of that area. If you see some of the older industrial areas that are beginning to convert, you're seeing waterfronts develop in Hamilton, you're seeing Main Street's development, Barton Street. So there's an interesting thing that's happening there where the design community and the development community are seeing great opportunities, and finally a market, because it's always been weak on market, like it's too far from Toronto, all of this stuff. But Hamilton, they've got a boost again in their commitment to an LRT down King Street and Main Street. So that has regenerated interest in growth there. So Hamilton has some of those bones and some of that market appeal now that is making it, for us, a busier place. I'd say almost half of our work is now in that area.
So can we talk a little bit about what kind of development you think is going to take place? I had the privilege of interviewing Michael, the author of a book called The Missing Middle. And he argued that zoning regulations, not demand, but zoning regulations had forced us either into building suburban sprawl that was, he said, 6 units per acre or less, or condos that were 58 units per acre or more, sometimes in the 100 to 200 units per acre. And he said what people really like is the Port Credits, the Blue Rest Villages. He used places in Vancouver, Kitsilano as examples that he said were between 20 and 40 units per acre. And he said, that's what people like to live in, and that's what we need to build. What do you think we're going to be building? What's going to be in demand in the future? And is it zoning that stops us from building that, or is it demand?
Well, it's both these things. And I'll tell you, one of the problems on doing the smaller developments, or let's call them more of the boutique infill developments, or even the lane housing, as soon as you lay on the approval process and the potential for opposition from neighbors, the NIMBY factor, you begin to see a process that takes on great expense and years for approval. So small projects simply can't weather that type of uncertainty and that challenge. So that's where you're seeing, developers are saying, no, I'm not going to go into any project unless I have a 200 to 500 unit kind of window that allows me to carry on the next 5 years to get an approval. But if you apply opposition,
5 years to get approval, that's how long it takes?
Oh, I've got a hearing coming up. It started in 2017. It's only now getting heard, and it's still going to be fought. And so things take that amount of time.
Why do they take that time? Is it bureaucracy? Is it that they justifiably need that amount of time to be, understood and inspected?
Well, it goes to the question of what is zoning and official plans? What do they create as an as of right condition? And what you see is, and it's enshrined in what we call the yellow belt, the yellow being those areas of the zoning map and the official plan map that are all detached single houses. And that's a sacred ground that you can assume they'll be fighting against almost anything that goes in, like a laneway house or making a single house into a 3-unit house. There's an entire arm of the LPAT that was passed on to Toronto called TLAB. And TLAB basically only deals with those appeals that have to do with Toronto, mostly infill housing in Toronto. Single detached stuff, opposition to that, someone wanting to add a floor on the top of their house, someone wanting to make a triplex out of a single. That process too takes forever. I've been involved in 3 of those recently, and I can tell you they've taken the better part of 2 years on individual house applications. So that's simply, and they're there because the current zoning simply doesn't allow enough of what I call as of right or missing middle sort of ideas. The only way missing middle can really work is if you can simplify the process, shorten it, make it predictable, and make sure there isn't going to be an appeal timeline that's crazy. And that would assist in making that whole sector work better.
If that zoning got solved, if that process got solved, do you think that's what people want? Do people really want to live in those, 20 to 40 units per acre kind of developments? And he described them as townhouses, stacked townhouses, houses that were close together, like in Port Credit or Blue Earth Village, rather than the big suburban sprawl that seems to be what's under demand right now.
Well, I think, the detached house, I'm afraid, will always have a certain level of appeal and a kind of idea about rewarding oneself for some point in life where you can afford it, I suppose. But what we're seeing in the back-to-back townhouse option is one that emulates the qualities of living close to grade. I think it's a good model. It's a pretty high density model. It performs well from a development perspective. So we're seeing some growth in that. The idea of the back-to-back or stacked townhouse that gives you a bit of either a roof terrace or a ground terrace or a combination of the both. These are, I think it's a format that will continue to grow. But even so, the ones we've seen still have up to 200 to 300 units involved. Some of them are still large developments from a developer's perspective. So the risk and the challenge to get it approved is there. I did a live hearing last August where we were, the developer was proposing a stacked townhouse proposal, which had good densities. I forget the precise numbers, but they might have been 40 to 60 units per hectare or units per hectare. And the city in this case, the city was supporting it, but the opposing neighbor was saying, look, the official plan says you're supposed to have a mixed use building of 8 to 12 stories with continuous retail at the grade, none of which was, let's call it, viable from the development perspective. The retail had proven not to be a viable starting point. So we had to go fight one of the opposing neighbors to say that a stacked townhouse project was absolutely the right urban form. It was the right walkability kind of component in this district, and it was much better than the sprawl that existed around it. And it was at the edge of a Costco and a kind of intensification site that was killing the small retail function. So what we ended up with there was a development that had what we call flexible retail units. So they could grow into become a fully functioning retail unit at grade. It had the right size, the right relationship of grade. But in the early stages when demand was weak, they would become components of a residence. They'd be a residential component that could be a home office. Home office is now emerging as a huge component of any project, whether it be a condo. In the condos we're having shared workspace as part of the amenity package, so that you can, within your building, go down to the main floor or go up to a roof terrace, and you have a working function, a shared work environment.
I see more and more condo advertisements advertising, second or third bedroom or work office, work from home office.
Exactly. Yeah, and this is brought on by the COVID situation now. It's the shared work, or let's say the incubator type of arrangement, was always it was emerging even before COVID. But when COVID hits, all of a sudden it's taken the spotlight. And it's it's going to change the way we function. People will now, I think, buy condominiums knowing that even if they only have a 2-bedroom and they need them, they have a space to go to where they could work with a laptop, an internet connection. All of that is supportive of an alternative way of managing your business.
Do you think that's going to be in a common workspace rather than in their own condo itself?
It'll be in the condo, but it's like, instead of a party room, for example, which are rarely used, it will be more of a common workspace area.
People are going to want to leave their floor, leave their own condo, go downstairs to the party room, now become a common work area, and work with other people during this era?
Well, during COVID, obviously there's going to be some controls on the use of it, but I think beyond COVID, I think the change we'll see is that you'll be able to work from home maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and then show up at an office or a workplace maybe those other days of the week. That I'm seeing as a new trend. So the ability to have, if you don't have space in your house, like I'm sitting in the corner of my living room right now, so it works for a while, but I've got enough space to do that. But in a smaller, tighter condo environment, that may be more difficult.
So do you think condo sizes will therefore increase?
Well, they will, but at the expense of affordability, right? That's the downside of this. If you can't afford a car, you're going to try to buy a unit that offers enough space for you to live. And I think spaces like common workspaces will become almost routine in buildings. We're seeing it almost as part of the amenity package now, really? Especially when retail is not viable.
Any other changes that you see to typical condos? Are people using their pools and their fitness areas as much?
Well, again, only through tight controls. So as long as there's contact limits, those rooms are going to be less used. And what we are seeing and hearing about is an incredible uptick in home gym equipment. Everyone's buying or trying to buy, exercise bikes. You've seen the Peloton ads. I mean, people are capitalizing on the changes that COVID is bringing. So I think there'll be more of that home workout idea. There's certainly more interest in walkability. I can tell you, just where we live and looking out on the river now and out on the street on the front, there's nonstop streams of people enjoying a sunny day. That is a very positive thing, to see the community being used in a way that wasn't like this, a year ago. So hopefully some of those stick. Some of those concepts and the way people use the city stick. I think they're going to be home more. They're going to, even under a new regime, we're debating whether we need an office anymore. Once you make a transition from an office environment to we have a 10-person office, but all of our workers are working from home. We have one person at the office, our office manager, who maintains the connections and the banking and all that stuff. But this idea of a hub with kind of distended fingers, if you will, of workplaces could become almost a preferred solution for a small firm. Two of our people have young children at home who don't, are in and out of school still. Is still uncertain how that's going to play out. So there's flexibility that's offered by having a home presence. Not necessarily an easy thing to deal with, but when a child is looking for a demand, it's like my pet. He's going to start barking soon because he'll want to go out. But the child will bark as well. Anyway, these are all things that could be good outcomes that I think will reduce the demand on central office space or corporate office space. And it varies by scale of enterprise, obviously. We have a size that's relatively small, but I know when we did work for Tim Hortons, they were moving towards this idea, 4 years ago, of where every worker didn't have to be in the office every day. And they didn't have enclosed offices. And they had the Google idea of the shared workstation where 6 people would come at specific times. They'd be on their computer, their laptop, but they weren't expected to be there. It wasn't their home station. They would be expected to be either on the road or out or working from home. And that affected their whole corporate kind of mission and identity. So we saw a major shift in a corporation like that has over 600 or 700 people involved with it, to a new model that was geared to a more youthful, that sort of mindset. So in fact, when they implemented some of these things, some of their older people couldn't handle it. They needed an office with walls around it. They needed privacy, things like that. They weren't used to the Zoom environment. So there's demographics that plays in this. There's scale of enterprise that gets involved in this. But I think everything's converging more now, I'd say, to this idea of the extended workplace with multiple locations brought together through technology. So the focus is going to be on technology.
With multiple locations brought together by technology. Sounds like it makes sense. We're chatting tonight with Michael Spaziani, an architect and urban planner, about the changes because of COVID-19 to our built environment. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with Michael Spaziani. Fascinating conversation with Michael, a local architect and urban planner, about how COVID-19 has changed things. Michael, has COVID-19 and what you think is going to happen changed things dramatically, or is it an acceleration of something that was already happening?
Yeah, this is to me a very interesting thing, because I believe we were starting on this trend of decentralization of office, emphasis on complete communities. The idea, even Jane Jacobs' idea of a community that might only be about 2 miles in circumference or in diameter. I think what COVID has done is sort of cemented these ideas and said, you see how important it is in light of a pandemic. So we're seeing some of these initiatives that we had started in our practice 10 years ago, in fact, started in Mississauga's strategic planning thing. Complete communities, accommodating all stages of life, having vibrant cores, this idea of a walkable focal points, all started years ago, 10 years ago. And what we're seeing now in our projects is really an affirmation that we need those spaces, especially when there are problems with contact, problems with disease spread. So having, the idea of having more open space that's connected to a development site, it's huge now. And it's really been pushed because of the COVID demand. You need more space, you need wider sidewalks, you need more amenity when you're walking. You need more distance when you're walking. So all of these things are coming home, and COVID sort of is saying, look, I told you so. This is what we got to do, because When you get too tight and too hard and too urban and too concrete, you're going to see the downside of not having enough amenity in our communities and enough complete activity.
Michael, I got to ask you, I think that was an incredible conversation about urban planning. What led you to be a guitarist for a rock and roll band?
Well, that went on. I can tell you, performances went sideways. So our little band is disbanded, other than any virtual things. But it's real. I've taken a hard hit on that because I've got two bands in the offing right now just to get together for jamming, and we can't even get together. So I'm busy learning tunes. It's almost like a developer getting a site ready for when COVID ends. Trying to get set lists together, but to me, it's an important part of my life. I'm not a great musician, but I enjoy it immensely, and it's a social event for me.
I think a lot of the things that you've mentioned in regards to acceleration of some of these trends that were taking place anyway is kind of interesting, because that's what's happened in digitization of our economy. That's happened in I think things in regards to retail. So I think it is interesting that COVID-19 has really sort of accelerated a bunch of different trends that were happening or were going to happen anyway. And it's fascinating to chat with you about it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, you're welcome. This Zoom call is a great example of that changing.
Well, that's our show for tonight. Thank you to Michael Spaziani, an architect and urban planner based out of Mississauga, but active across the GTA and Hamilton, for joining us and talking about how our urban environment is going to change because of COVID-19. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.